The lock fought her like it had a personal grudge, metal grinding against metal as Delilah Evans twisted the key with enough force to make her wrist ache. Dust from the day's wind still clung to her navy traveling dress, and her dark hair had come loose from its pins during the long stagecoach ride from Cheyenne. The small house her aunt had left her stood stubbornly closed, the door refusing to budge despite her best efforts with the key the lawyer had sent 3 weeks prior. She had traveled over 100 miles to Fort Bridger, Wyoming in this summer of 1878, expecting a simple new beginning, not a battle with her own front door. "Let me help you with that lock, miss." The voice came from behind her, deep and steady, and Delilah spun around so fast she nearly dropped the key. A man stood at the edge of her small porch, hat in hand, the late afternoon sun turning his brown hair copper at the edges. He was tall, broad-shouldered in that way men got from actual labor rather than posturing, and his sun-weathered face suggested he spent more time outdoors than in. His eyes were a striking gray-blue, like storm clouds over distant mountains, and they held genuine concern rather than the presumption she had learned to expect from strangers. "I apologize for startling you," he continued, taking a respectful step back. "I am Harrison Reid. I own the ranch that borders your property to the north. I saw you struggling and thought perhaps the lock had rusted. These Wyoming winters can be harsh on metalwork, especially when a house sits empty." Delilah felt her shoulders relax slightly. His manner was courteous, and she could see no threat in his open expression. "Delilah Evans, and yes, this lock seems determined to keep me out of my own inheritance." Harrison moved closer, asking permission with his eyes before he approached the door. "May I take a look? I have some experience with stubborn mechanisms." She handed him the key, watching as he examined both it and the lock with careful attention. His hands were large and capable, scarred in places from work she could only imagine. He tried the key once, withdrew it, and pulled a small tin from his vest pocket. "The problem is rust and grit," he explained, applying what appeared to be some kind of grease to the key. "Your aunt, Mrs. Margaret Ellsworth, was a fine woman. She passed 4 months back, and her house has been closed up since. The spring rains would have gotten into this lock, and then the summer heat baked it dry." He inserted the key again, this time wiggling it gently while applying steady pressure. Something inside the mechanism gave way with a reluctant click. "There we are." The door swung open, revealing a dim interior that smelled of closed spaces and old lavender. Delilah felt an unexpected tightness in her chest. She had never met her Aunt Margaret, her father's elder sister who had left Boston 40 years ago and never returned. The estrangement had been complete until the lawyer's letter arrived, informing Delilah that she was the sole heir to a house and 5 acres in Fort Bridger, Wyoming territory. "Thank you, Mr. Reid," she said, meaning it sincerely. "I was beginning to think I would be spending my first night in Wyoming on my own porch." He smiled then, a genuine expression that reached his eyes and transformed his serious face into something warmer. "Harrison, please." "And you are welcome. Mrs. Ellsworth was a good neighbor. She helped my mother considerably when we first came to Wyoming 15 years ago. I am glad her property has gone to family." He hesitated, then added, "If you need anything, help with repairs or supplies, my ranch is just north along the creek. Follow the line of cottonwoods and you cannot miss it." "I appreciate that, Harrison." His name felt strange on her tongue, intimate somehow despite their brief acquaintance. He settled his hat back on his head, nodded respectfully, and walked down the porch steps toward a waiting horse, a handsome bay gelding that stood ground tied near the gate. Delilah watched him mount with the easy grace of someone who had been riding since childhood, and then he was gone, cantering down the dirt road that led through the scattered buildings of Fort Bridger. She turned to face her new home, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The house was smaller than she had expected but solidly built, with real glass windows and wooden floors that showed evidence of careful maintenance. The main room served as both kitchen and sitting area, with a black iron stove, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, and a rocking chair positioned near the fireplace. 2 additional rooms opened off the main space, one clearly a bedroom with a brass bed frame and a patchwork quilt, the other set up as a storage room filled with crates and barrels. Delilah spent the remaining daylight hours opening windows to air out the rooms, sweeping away dust and mouse droppings, and taking inventory of what her aunt had left behind. The cupboards held dishes and cooking implements, all of good quality. The storage room contained enough preserved foods to last several months, along with candles, lamp oil, and other necessities. Her aunt had been prepared and practical, qualities Delilah recognized from her own upbringing. As darkness fell, she lit a lamp and made herself a simple meal of tinned beans and hard bread from her traveling bag. Sitting at the table, eating by lamplight, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. Boston had offered her nothing but a dreary future as an unpaid companion to her widowed cousin, a woman whose bitterness had grown sharper with each passing year. When the lawyer's letter arrived, Delilah had been 24 years old, unmarried, and desperate for a change. Wyoming had sounded impossibly far away, almost mythical, but the promise of property and independence had been too powerful to resist. She thought about Harrison Reid as she prepared for bed, wondering about the man who had appeared so conveniently when she needed help. His manner had been kind without being forward, helpful without demanding gratitude. She had met enough men in Boston to recognize the difference between genuine decency and calculated charm. Sleep came slowly in the unfamiliar bed, accompanied by the night sounds of Wyoming. Wind rushing through cottonwood leaves, the distant yip of coyotes, the creek that ran behind the property singing its endless song over smooth stones. Morning brought brilliant sunshine and a determination to explore her new property thoroughly. Delilah, dressed in her simplest calico dress, pinned her hair back securely, and ventured outside. The 5 acres included the house and its immediate yard, a small barn that leaned slightly to one side, and several overgrown garden plots that had once been productive. The creek Harrison had mentioned formed the northern boundary, its banks lined with those tall cottonwoods that shimmered silver green in the morning light. She was examining the barn, trying to determine if it could be salvaged or if it would need to be rebuilt entirely, when she heard the sound of an approaching horse. Harrison appeared, leading a pack mule laden with supplies. "Good morning," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the quiet yard. "I hope I am not intruding. I thought you might need some fresh provisions, and my housekeeper insisted I bring over some bread and eggs." Delilah walked over to meet him, surprised and touched by the gesture. "That is very kind. Please, thank your housekeeper for me." Harrison dismounted and began unloading supplies, refusing her attempts to help with a gentle stubbornness. "Mrs. Chen would have my hide if I let you carry these. She is convinced you will starve without proper food, and I learned long ago not to argue with her." He set down a basket that smelled of fresh baked bread, followed by a crate containing eggs packed in straw, a chunk of butter wrapped in waxed cloth, and a jar of what appeared to be berry preserves. "This is far too much," Delilah protested, though her stomach growled at the sight and smell of real food. "It is barely enough," Harrison countered. He looked past her at the leaning barn. "That structure is not safe, It should come down before winter. I was just thinking the same thing, Delilah admitted, though I have no idea how to go about demolishing a barn. I could help with that, Harrison offered immediately, then seemed to catch himself. If you would like the assistance, I mean. I have no wish to presume or intrude on your independence. Delilah studied him carefully. His offer seemed genuine, without any expectation of compensation or obligation. In Boston, such help would have come with strings attached, assumptions made about what a single woman owed a helpful man. But Harrison simply stood there, patient and respectful, waiting for her answer. I would appreciate help, she said finally, though I insist on paying you for your time and labor. Harrison shook his head firmly. Your aunt helped my family when we needed it. Consider this a return of that kindness. Besides, it is what neighbors do out here. We depend on each other. They spent the next hour discussing what needed to be done with the property. Harrison proved to be knowledgeable without being condescending, listening to her ideas and offering practical suggestions. When he finally left, promising to return in 2 days with tools and help for the barn, Delilah felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Hope, perhaps, or the beginning of belonging. The following days established a pattern. Delilah worked on cleaning and organizing her house, discovering small treasures her aunt had left behind. A set of beautiful china painted with tiny flowers, a carved wooden box containing letters from her father to his sister, a leather-bound journal that documented Margaret Ellsworth's life in Wyoming from her arrival in 1838 until just weeks before her death. Reading her aunt's words by lamplight, Delilah felt a connection across the years. Margaret had left Boston as a young bride, traveling west with a husband who died of cholera before they reached Wyoming. She had pressed on alone, claiming this land, building this house, creating a life through sheer determination and hard work. She had never remarried, had never had children, but her journal entries spoke of a full life, rich with friendships and purpose. One entry in particular caught Delilah's attention. Young Harrison Reid helped me repair the chicken coop today. He is only 15 but works like a man grown and so serious about everything. His mother says he has been the man of their family since his father died 3 years past. I see the weight of responsibility on his young shoulders and wish I could ease it somehow. But he has good character, that boy. He will grow into a fine man. Delilah calculated quickly. If Harrison had been 15 when her aunt wrote that entry 9 years ago, he would be 24 now, exactly her own age. Something about that coincidence pleased her. When Harrison returned as promised, he brought 2 additional men with him, a grizzled older cowhand named Jack Sullivan and a younger man called Tommy who could not have been more than 18. Together, they made short work of assessing the barn's condition. The frame is still partially good, Harrison announced after a thorough inspection. If we take it down carefully, we can salvage enough lumber to build you a decent shed for tools and firewood. The rest can be used for kindling. Delilah watched them work throughout the morning, fascinated by the coordination and efficiency of their movements. They had clearly worked together before, anticipating each other's actions, calling out warnings when needed. Harrison directed the operation with quiet authority, always ensuring everyone's safety as they dismantled the structure piece by piece. At midday, Delilah brought out lunch, cold chicken, fresh bread, and lemonade she had made from supplies Harrison had brought. The men settled in the shade of the cottonwoods, and she found herself sitting beside Harrison, acutely aware of his presence. "You have done this kind of work before," she observed, watching how he flexed his right hand, which had been gripping a crowbar all morning. "Ranching requires many skills," Harrison replied, Building, repairing, tearing down, starting over. I learned early that nothing stays the same out here. You adapt or you fail. Your father, Delilah ventured carefully, remembering her aunt's journal entry. My aunt mentioned that he passed when you were young. Harrison's expression grew distant. 12 years ago now. He was breaking a horse and it threw him badly. He lingered for 3 days before the fever took him. He paused, then continued in a quieter voice. I was the eldest of 4 children. My mother was strong, but running a ranch alone with young ones to care for was nearly impossible. Your aunt helped us considerably that first year. She would bring food, help with the younger children so my mother could rest. I have never forgotten that kindness. She wrote about you in her journal, Delilah found herself saying. She thought highly of you even then. Harrison turned to look at her directly, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. She was a remarkable woman. I am sorry you never had the chance to know her. I am learning about her through her writings, Delilah said, and through her choice to leave this place to me. I think perhaps she wanted to give me the same chance she had, a new beginning, a place to build something of my own. And will you stay? Harrison asked, and there was something in his voice that suggested the answer mattered to him deeply. I have nothing to return to in Boston, Delilah answered honestly. This is my home now, for better or worse. The smile that crossed Harrison's face was like sunrise, warm and bright. Then welcome to Wyoming, Delilah Evans. I think you will do well here. The work continued through the afternoon. By the time the sun began its descent toward the mountains, the barn had been completely dismantled, the salvageable lumber stacked neatly under canvas, and the debris cleared away. Harrison and his men departed with her thanks ringing in their ears and promises to return the following week to begin building the new shed. That night, Delilah dreamed of gray-blue eyes and capable hands, of a voice that spoke her name like it meant something precious. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity. Harrison and his men returned to build the shed, working in the cooler morning hours and taking shelter during the hottest part of the day. Delilah found herself looking forward to these visits with an anticipation that felt both thrilling and terrifying. She had been courted before in the stilted, formal way of Boston society, but those interactions had felt like performances, each party playing their assigned role. With Harrison, everything felt natural, uncontrived. They talked while he worked, conversations ranging from practical matters of ranch management to deeper discussions about books they had read, places they hoped to see someday, dreams they had harbored in quiet moments. She learned that Harrison had a brother and 2 sisters, all married now with families of their own. His mother had passed away 2 years prior, leaving him the ranch that he ran with the help of Jack and Tommy and a few seasonal hands. He raised cattle primarily, selling beef to the military at nearby Fort Bridger and to passing wagon trains when the opportunities arose. It was hard work with uncertain profits, but he loved the land and could not imagine doing anything else. In turn, Delilah told him about her life in Boston, the suffocating expectations placed on unmarried women, the gradual narrowing of possibilities as she aged past the point where marriage offers came freely. She spoke of her relief when the inheritance arrived, the terror of traveling so far alone, the strange exhilaration of arriving in a place where no one knew her history or held expectations about who she should become. You can be whoever you choose to be here, Harrison said one afternoon as they sat by the creek, taking refuge from the August heat. That is both the blessing and burden of the West. No one cares about your family name or your past. They only care about what you do now, how you treat others, whether you can be counted on when things get difficult. And what do you see when you look at me? Delilah asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving over her face with such careful attention that she felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the temperature. "I see someone brave," he said finally. "Someone willing to risk everything for a chance at something better. I see someone kind, who thanked my men individually for their help and learned their names and asked about their families. I see someone strong, who did not fall apart when faced with a locked door and an empty house in a strange place." He paused, then added in a lower voice, "I see someone I would very much like to know better if you would permit it." Delilah's heart hammered against her ribs. "I would like that too," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. His hand found hers in the grass between them, his rough palm warm against her softer skin. They sat like that as the creek sang its endless song and the cottonwood leaves shimmered overhead, neither speaking, both afraid to break the fragile, perfect moment. The shed was completed by late August, a sturdy structure that would serve Delilah well for storing tools, firewood, and supplies. Harrison had built it to last, with careful attention to every detail. When the final nail was driven and the last tool put away, he lingered, clearly reluctant to leave. "I suppose my excuses for visiting regularly have run out," he said with a rueful smile. "You do not need excuses," Delilah replied, emboldened by the weeks they had spent together. "You could simply visit because you wish to." "Then I will," Harrison promised, "if you will have me." "I will have you," Delilah confirmed, and the words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning beyond their simple surface. True to his word, Harrison began visiting regularly, though now he came alone, without the buffer of work projects or the presence of his ranch hands. They took walks along the creek, rode out to see the boundaries of both their properties, sat on her porch in the evenings watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. He was courting her, Delilah realized, though it looked nothing like the formal courtships she had known in Boston. There were no chaperones, no calling cards, no rigid rules about appropriate conversation topics. Instead, there was honesty, growing intimacy, the slow building of trust between two people learning to open their hearts. September brought cooler temperatures, and the first hints of autumn color in the aspens that dotted the nearby hillsides. Harrison took Delilah to Fort Bridger proper, introducing her to the other residents, helping her establish connections with the merchant who ran the general store, the doctor who served the area, the families who lived in and around the old trading post that had given the settlement its name. People welcomed her warmly, clearly respecting her connection to Margaret Ellsworth and approving of her growing relationship with Harrison Reid. The older women in particular seemed delighted, making knowing comments about what a fine couple they made and how nice it would be to have a wedding to attend before winter set in. "They are not subtle," Delilah remarked to Harrison as they drove back to her property in his wagon, the bed loaded with supplies she had purchased. "No," Harrison agreed, amusement coloring his voice, "but they mean well. Matchmaking is a favorite pastime in small communities." "And does their matchmaking bother you?" Delilah asked, her heart beating faster. Harrison pulled the wagon to a stop in front of her house and turned to face her fully. The afternoon sun caught in his hair and made his eyes seem even brighter than usual. "No," he said simply. "It does not bother me at all. In fact, they are only saying what I have been thinking for weeks now." "And what have you been thinking?" Delilah barely breathed the words. "That I have fallen in love with you," Harrison said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the confession. "I know it has only been 2 months since we met, and by Boston standards that must seem impossibly fast, but out here we learn to recognize what matters quickly. Life is hard and uncertain, and when you find something good, something real, You do not waste time with pretense." He reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "I love you, Delilah Evans. I love your courage and your kindness and the way you laugh when you are genuinely delighted by something. I love how you read your aunt's journals and speak about her like you knew her. I love that you chose to stay here to make Wyoming your home, and I would very much like to marry you if you think you could love me in return." Tears stung Delilah's eyes, but they were tears of joy, of relief, of coming home in a way that had nothing to do with geography. "I do love you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I think I started falling in love with you the moment you offered to help with my lock, so kind and respectful and genuine. Everything I have learned about you since has only made me love you more." Harrison pulled her close, and Delilah went willingly into his arms, breathing in the scent of him, leather and sage and sunshine. When he kissed her, it felt like a promise, tender and passionate and full of hope for the future they would build together. "Marry me," Harrison whispered against her hair. "Soon. I do not want to spend another winter apart from you." "Yes," Delilah answered without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." They set the wedding for early October, wanting to marry before the weather turned harsh. The ceremony would be simple, held at the small community church in Fort Bridger, followed by a celebration at Harrison's ranch. Delilah spent the intervening weeks preparing, altering one of her better Boston dresses to serve as a wedding gown, working with Mrs. Chen to plan the celebration feast, packing up her belongings in preparation for moving to the ranch after the wedding. Harrison's siblings arrived in the days before the ceremony, traveling from their own ranches and homesteads scattered across Wyoming and neighboring territories. Delilah met his brother Henry, a jovial man, 2 years younger than Harrison, who raised horses near Laramie. His sisters Helen and Hannah proved to be warm, welcoming women who embraced Delilah immediately, exclaiming over her good fortune in catching Harrison's heart and teasing their brother mercilessly about his lovesick expression. "We had almost given up hope," Helen confided as she helped Delilah with final alterations to the wedding dress. "Harrison has been so serious for so long, so focused on the ranch and taking care of everyone else. It is wonderful to see him happy, to see him thinking about his own future." The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, the October sky a brilliant blue unmarred by clouds. Delilah dressed carefully, her hands only slightly trembling as she fastened the tiny buttons of her gown. It was a simple dress of cream-colored silk, elegant in its simplicity, with long sleeves and a modest neckline appropriate for a woman of her age and station. She wore her dark hair swept up, decorated with small white flowers that Harrison had brought her the night before. When she entered the church on the arm of Jack Sullivan, who had insisted on the honor of giving her away, she saw Harrison waiting at the altar and felt her breath catch. He wore a dark suit that must have been new, his hair neatly combed, his face clean-shaven. But it was his expression that undid her. Pure joy, unmistakable love, the look of a man who could not believe his good fortune. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Delilah heard herself speak her vows, her voice clear and certain despite her racing heart. Harrison's voice was steady and strong as he promised to love and cherish her for all the days of their lives. The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and then Harrison was kissing her in front of God and the assembled community, and nothing had ever felt so right. The celebration at the ranch proved to be more elaborate than Delilah had expected. Mrs. Chen had outdone herself, preparing a feast that included roasted beef, fresh bread, vegetable dishes, and 3 different pies. Tables had been set up in the ranch yard and someone had brought a fiddle, and soon people were dancing in the afternoon sunshine, their laughter and conversation filling the air with joy. Harrison led Delilah through a dance, holding her close, his eyes never leaving her face. "Happy?" he asked. "Happier than I knew was possible," Delilah answered truthfully. As the sun set and the guests began to depart, Harrison took Delilah's hand and led her toward the ranch house that was now her home. It was larger than her aunt's house, a sprawling structure that Harrison's father had built and subsequent generations had added to. Mrs. Chen had already moved Delilah's belongings into the main bedroom, the room Harrison had occupied alone for so long. The nervousness Delilah had been holding at bay all day suddenly surged forward as they entered the private space. Harrison seemed to sense her anxiety and moved slowly, giving her time to adjust. "We have the rest of our lives," he said gently, cupping her face in his hands. "There is no rush, no pressure. Tonight and every night I only want you to feel safe and loved." His patience and consideration melted the last of her fears. Delilah reached up and pulled him down for a kiss, pouring into it all the love and trust she felt. What followed was tender and sweet, a joining of hearts as much as bodies, and when they finally lay tangled together in the darkness, Delilah felt truly married, truly home. The first months of marriage brought adjustments and revelations. Delilah learned the rhythms of ranch life, the early mornings and long days, the constant attention required to keep animals healthy and fences mended. She worked alongside Mrs. Chen, learning to cook for ranch hands and manage a larger household. She rode out with Harrison when weather permitted, learning the boundaries of their land, meeting the cattle that represented their livelihood. Winter arrived in November with shocking speed, bringing snow that piled in deep drifts and temperatures that made stepping outside feel like a physical assault. The ranch became an isolated bubble, cut off from the outside world for days at a time. But inside the house, there was warmth and companionship. Harrison taught Delilah to play chess on long evenings by the fire. She read aloud to him from books she had brought from Boston. They talked for hours, learning each other's histories in greater depth, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Christmas brought Harrison's siblings back to the ranch, along with their spouses and children. The house filled with noise and laughter, with children racing through rooms and adults catching up on months of news. Delilah found herself surrounded by family in a way she had never experienced before, and the warmth of it brought tears to her eyes more than once. "You have given me this," Harrison said as they stood together watching his nieces and nephews play in the snow. "You have made this house feel like a home again. I did not realize how lonely I had been until you filled that emptiness." "We filled it together," Delilah corrected, leaning into his warmth. Spring of 1879 brought new beginnings. Delilah discovered she was pregnant in March, the news filling both her and Harrison with joy and no small amount of terror. She continued to work through the pregnancy, though Harrison became increasingly protective, constantly worrying about her health and safety. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," Delilah reminded him with amusement when he tried to prevent her from hanging laundry. "I am not made of glass." "You are carrying my child," Harrison countered, his hand settling gently over the small swell of her stomach. "You are the most precious thing in my world. Forgive me for wanting to keep you safe." How could she argue with that? Their son was born in late October, arriving after a long labor that left Delilah exhausted but triumphant. Harrison wept when the doctor placed the squalling infant in his arms, and watching her strong husband reduced to tears of joy over their child made Delilah fall in love with him all over again. They named him Henry James Reid, honoring both Harrison's brother and Delilah's father. He was a healthy baby with Harrison's eyes and Delilah's dark hair, and from his first moments, he had both of them completely captivated. The years that followed brought both challenges and blessings. A harsh winter in 1880 killed some of their cattle, setting them back financially. But the following year brought excellent calf crops and good prices, allowing them to recover and expand. Delilah gave birth to a daughter in 1882, a spirited little girl they named Dorothy Margaret, honoring Delilah's mother and her aunt. Another son followed in 1884, whom they named Harold Thomas after beloved friends. Through it all, Delilah and Harrison's love deepened and matured. They weathered difficulties together, celebrated triumphs together, built a life that was richer and fuller than either had imagined possible. The ranch prospered under their joint management, Delilah's practical Boston upbringing combining well with Harrison's ranching expertise. On a warm September evening in 1888, 10 years after the day Harrison had first helped her with a stubborn lock, Delilah stood on the porch of their home watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson. Their children played in the yard under Mrs. Chen's watchful eye. Henry at 9 showing his younger siblings how to skip stones in the creek. Dorothy at 6 organizing some elaborate game that only she fully understood, little Harold toddling after them with determined 4-year-old persistence. Harrison came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About that day I could not get into my own house," Delilah said, leaning back against him. "About a kind stranger who stopped to help. About how one small moment can change everything." "Best decision I ever made," Harrison murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Stopping to help a beautiful woman struggling with a lock." "Best decision I ever made was accepting your help," Delilah countered. "And every decision after that led me here, to this life, to you, to our family." "No regrets about leaving Boston?" Harrison asked, though by now he knew the answer. "Not a single one," Delilah confirmed. "Wyoming gave me everything I never knew I needed. It gave me purpose, independence, a home. But most importantly, it gave me you." Harrison turned her in his arms so they faced each other, his gray-blue eyes holding that same intensity that had captured her heart 10 years ago. "I love you, Delilah Reid, today and every day for the rest of our lives. And I love you, Harrison Reid. Always and forever." As the sun completed its descent behind the mountains and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they stood together, watching their children play, secure in the knowledge that they had built something lasting and true. The life they had created together was not always easy, but it was theirs, forged through love and partnership and unwavering commitment to each other. In the years that followed, their family would continue to grow, with 2 more children arriving before Delilah decided her childbearing years were complete. The ranch would expand, becoming one of the most successful operations in southwestern Wyoming. Henry would eventually take over the ranch, continuing his father's legacy, while Dorothy would become a teacher and Harold would study law. Their younger children would each find their own paths, but all of them would carry with them the lessons learned from watching their parents build a marriage based on mutual respect, genuine partnership, and enduring love. But that warm September evening in 1888, none of the future mattered as much as the present moment. Harrison and Delilah stood together on their porch, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had created, and knew they had found something rare and precious. A love that transformed 2 lonely individuals into a united whole, stronger together than either could ever be alone. The lock that had brought them together all those years ago still hung on the door of Delilah's inherited house, though the property itself had been integrated into the ranch. Sometimes, when Delilah visited the now rarely used building, She would run her fingers over that old lock and remember the day a cowboy had stopped to help her, the day her real life had begun. She had traveled halfway across a continent looking for independence and a fresh start. What she had found was so much more. A partner who valued her strength while offering his own, a love that grew deeper with each passing year, a family that filled her days with purpose and joy, and a place in the world that was entirely her own. As autumn gave way to winter and winter to spring, as the years accumulated, and their children grew and eventually started families of their own, Harrison and Delilah remained constants in each other's lives. They grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard work, but their love remaining as vital and essential as it had been that first summer they met. When Harrison passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1920 at the age of 66, Delilah held his hand and whispered thank you for 42 years of happiness, for the life they had built, for the love that had sustained her through every challenge. She mourned him deeply, but without bitterness, grateful for every moment they had shared. She lived another 5 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the matriarch of a family that had spread throughout Wyoming and beyond. But her heart remained with Harrison, and when she finally joined him in 1925, it felt less like an ending and more like a reunion. They were buried side by side in the small cemetery outside Fort Bridger, their headstones simple but elegant, inscribed with their names and the years of their lives. Visitors to the cemetery might not know their story, might not understand the depth of love those two simple stones represented, but their descendants knew. The story of how Harrison Reid helped Delilah Evans with a stubborn lock and found his life forever changed became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. It was a story about kindness and courage, about taking chances and opening hearts, about building something lasting in a harsh and unforgiving land. But most of all, it was a love story, as real and true as any that had ever been told, proving that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the smallest acts of service, and that love, when nurtured and cherished, can indeed last forever. The ranch they built together still stands, owned now by descendants who honor the legacy Harrison and Delilah created. The house has been expanded and modernized, but the bones remain the same, solid and true like the love that first made it a home. And on quiet evenings when the Wyoming wind whispers through the cottonwoods, some say you can still feel their presence. Two souls who found each other against all odds and chose to build a life together, their love echoing through generations, timeless and unbreakable.